Welcome to Towers, a Metazoo podcast, the final episode for this circuit, for real this time. I'm really happy looking back with the material we've covered. A lot of it feels evergreen and that it can be applied to other card games, which is important because I'm going to do a little rebrand. We're moving from Towers, a Metazoo podcast to Towers TCG podcasts, just to give me a little bit more flexibility in what I talk about, especially as Metazoo is moving into an off-season. We don't have any tournaments on the horizon. We have a lot of unknowns as far as sets go. We don't know what's going to be in Legacy in December. They just announced an SCP set, or like a piece of an SCP set that might be dropping in February, but there have been a lot of delays throughout the year. There's a bunch of promos we haven't seen. There's those new disclosure pages. It's going to be like a pretty sizable promo set. We don't know what those cards are. Like, the ones they printed for Cosmic were really good. So until we know what the next tournaments are, when Caster Cup is, we just don't really know if any of the decks we could build now are going to be useful. We don't know when to prepare for. For all we know, it could be well after war. It could be, around 7 Seas. We will see. And I do want to keep covering other things while we're in off seasons. What you can look forward to specifically is getting into Nom Nom Verse, which is a new card game that will be kickstarting in February. Johnny Dunn, aka Moldy Potions, who you've heard a clip of in this show, is the one doing a lot of the R&D for it. Victor Larson, who is the original art guy for Metazoo, drew a lot of your favorite cards, is the main creative mind behind it, and it really shows off kind of his art style. And now I've seen gameplay, and I really like the gameplay, so I'm going to be helping you prep for that game. Conveniently, it seems like the on-season for that is during the off-season for Metazoo, so I'm not really having to choose one or the other. But today's topic does apply to most card games, at least ones without broken formats, and that is Variance. You have a 40-card spellbook in this game. In others, you're going to have like a 60-card deck. You shuffle it, you randomize it, you draw 7 cards, which means most of your deck is still sitting on the table, and it can be in any kind of order. That's a lot of the appeal of these games, is having to know your deck and your competition well enough to work with whatever's in front of you, building a deck that consistently draws well, that has solid synergy, that is flexible, that doesn't need too many combos. It is so satisfying when you finally build something that works like clockwork, you bring it to the table, and it just functions. However, it's not always going to be your day. I learned this firsthand at Dark Tower, and after my 2023 Towers experience, I think there were a lot of fun things to learn about that. So with a game like Metazoo, where you have about 200 competitive players, and you're usually going to see like 150 to 175 of them in a big tournament, it's impossible to do like a bona fide scientific study. That being said, as far as case studies go, I've now had the benefit of going to 2 of these towers with a team, Legion of Doom, which consists of really consistent competitive players. And I'd like to tell you about some of my games at previous towers. At Water Tower, I faced a lot of spellbooks that I felt were really evenly matched against mine, and I had one significant loss where it did feel like Variance. Everyone's going to talk about Aura Screw. I've talked about Aura Screw, where you're either getting too much or not enough aura. And those are games where your opponent's going to look across from you and be like, hey, terrible luck. Hopefully we can play a good match later. In Earth Tower, my game's day 2, I had to mulligan down to 5, and there was still just no aura in my hand. But I knew my spellbook worked. I didn't have any trouble the day before, and a lot of my testing for that event was just trying to get the curve as strong and consistent as possible. And so I wasn't upset that I lost. It was a great learning experience. It helped me forge a stronger friendship with my opponent, and it gives us both something to look forward to or not look forward to in the future when we're sitting across from each other at the table. And Flame Tower went really smoothly for me. While I did have some iffy games where I wasn't pulling what I needed, our spellbook was really strong, and that was a tournament where I felt very prepared, so I was usually able to maneuver around. You're gonna have different levels of lucky and unlucky during a game that's not necessarily gonna cost you the game if you play well, but then you're gonna have some games where it's just like, this feels unwinnable. And just about every game I lost was to an opponent managing to play multiple Piazza birds with a bunch of lightning in a bottles, which was not a tournament winning strategy. If you look at those final tables, that just didn't exist. But with 170 people, a few of them are going to eke through. A few of them, they're going to be on the other side of Variance. It's going to be their lucky day. They're going to be unstoppable until they are, or until they take the whole tournament. I don't think we've seen that yet. If you look at the various top 8s at these towers, those spellbooks tend to be really consistent. But then you can have the deck. You can have the deck that ends up winning the whole thing or gets to semifinals, and you can still find yourself losing a lot of your matches. And you might have a tournament-winning spellbook and lose half of your matches and think that you're not a good player or that your spellbook was poorly built. And that's where this anecdotal experience with my team comes in. So during Flame Tower, Legion of Doom had built out to 6 players, and all 6 players went to the Flame Tower. We all had the exact same spellbook. We had run it through the same scenarios. We put a lot of work into the tournament. At the end of the whole thing, we had determined that there was one card we could have played that would have made a big difference, but we could not complain about 3 people in top 8, 1 in top 16. It was clear the spellbook worked out well for us. But 2 of the players didn't make it to top 32, Logan and Herman. And if you've been around the tournament scene, you know Logan and Herman consistently make it to top 32. Herman has a top 8, a second place, and now a top 16 under his belt. Logan has several top 16s, a top 32 under his belt. Both of these are players with more experience than me. I have learned a lot from them. Both of these players made it to top 32 of every tower except for Flame. And this is where the lesson of variance comes in. As we were going through the day and reporting our wins and losses, something that really helped keeping our mindset honed was knowing everyone else is playing the same deck. And a benefit of that is that you're not losing out just because you're unlucky. I'm confident that both Herman and Logan played just as strong of a game as any of us. I know that if either had made it to top 32, they would have done just as well. Our team strategy worked. The majority of us made it to day 2, and it really showed the impact of variance, the importance of going to a lot of tournaments if you want to get an idea of your skill level, the benefit of having a team where you can really see how the deck shines and maybe ways it could be improved because you're just getting more data, you're playing more games with it. And it also leans into something Rami said in the very first episode of this podcast of don't be afraid of anyone you're sitting across from because it might be your day and it might not be their day. If you identify the best players in the game, they all have losses and only a few can boast topping every single tower. But what does it look like on the other end? During Dark Tower, outside of getting sick, it just wasn't my day. While it did impact my performance, there were certain scenarios that it doesn't matter how healthy I was or how prepared I was, there's just not a lot I could do about them. So one match, I believe it was match 6, I had the most consistent aura screw I've ever had in my life. I mulliganed down, we managed to play New Year's. It was a draw-heavy format with Black Mass routinely letting you pick up 4 cards. And there was just no aura in the deck. We played more aura than a lot of people did, and yet I kept going. Even my opponent was impressed by how just I could not pull it for the life of me. For the next game, I shuffled and I shuffled and I shuffled, and a very unlikely scenario happened in which all I was pulling was aura. It was aura after aura. I was sitting there with a full hand. I had played so few beasties during that game and just enough to kind of keep from getting stomped altogether. It didn't matter how prepared I was. And because they did a change with Dark Tower, where the highest ranked people day 1 got to choose who went first during day 2. Pretty much everyone was playing most of their matches out, which meant you didn't have the normal thing where you could just get a handful of wins and then draw out for the rest of the day. Because a lot of other people were going to play it out, they're going to get more points than usual, and you might get knocked out of the running for top 32. That definitely happened to a few people. So at Dark Tower, once you hit those 3 losses, you were done. During another match, I had games where I just did not get the strategy off at all. Things I had no trouble with the first 4 matches, I just could not do for the life of me for the back half of the day. I was not pulling the cards I needed, which was so unlikely once again in this format because of all of the card draw. It's just going to happen. And I was able to recognize, where it was working, where it wasn't, what my options were because of all of the practice we put in. But a thing that helped from being discouraged was watching my teammates. Herman was sweeping game after game. The others were doing extremely well. We were playing the same deck. We were talking about our games and what we pulled and didn't pull. And while that sickness had an effect, there were 2 matches that I don't think I could have won just because of those pulls. And we see this happen a lot at top 32. I watched Herman's top 16 game against the red ink deck. I knew that deck so well. We'd played out the whole thing multiple times during my games with Taylor, and because I managed to win game 2, I was pretty confident what the deck list was by the time we were done with our match. So I watched that game closely. I knew what our deck did, I knew what their deck did, and it was very interesting watching Herman make his plays. He's a very intentional player. But I saw the board state. I knew that he needed to play that Chibi Wendigo. That if Taylor had the red ink, it was going to be trouble. But if he didn't play the Chibi Wendigo now, he was going to be so far behind it would be really difficult to contend against that deck, which did really well in the late game. Now, a lot of that comes to matchup. I think their deck had the advantage against a lot of the field. But over at a different table, Ricky was playing Easton. Ricky was playing the same deck as us. Easton was playing the same deck as Taylor. And while it was 2-0 on one side, Ricky managed to close out that final game against Easton. So, have 4 extremely skilled, experienced players who know their decks playing the same matchup. 1 wins on each side, 1 loses on each side. It definitely helps walking away from a tournament, seeing your teammates succeed even if you don't. Legion of Doom truly works as a unit. Someone losing matches or not clearing till the next day isn't even a bump in the road, because the goal is to get as many of us as far as possible. And the best way to do that, on top of prep, is to play that numbers game. If you're a solo player like I was for so long, once the tournament is done, go look up the deck lists on the Play Network. Build them out in TTS and play them against your deck. While the bluffing angle isn't necessarily going to be there, if their deck is that much stronger than yours, you'll probably find that it wins out. But you might find that yours is pretty evenly matched, and you might have suffered from bad variance. Learn what you can, play your best, have respectful games with your opponents, make memories, and know that if you've come this far, you probably love these card games, and this is all part of your journey moving ahead and getting used to tournaments. The more I've hung out with people who've played these games competitively for decades, the more I see just how not fazed they are by their successes and failures, because they just know how it goes. And that's going to wrap up this block of Towers episodes. The next episode is going to be a little bit of a treat. I'm going to be bringing in some sound design and teaching you what I know about Nom Nomverse, prepping you all for the Kickstarter that's going to happen in just over 3 months. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I'm going to look forward to any announcements Metazoo has for what 2024 is looking like in the tournament scene. And I'm also going to enjoy the time off for a little while. Until next time. Towers, a Metazoo podcast, was created by me, Ester Ellis. The cover art was made by Chandler Candela. Music by the Heatley Bros. More details in the description. Want to say hello? Follow the show on Instagram at Towers Podcast. Send me an email at towersgamepodcast@gmail.com and say hi in Metazoo's Discord servers. Many of the figures in Metazoo originate in indigenous lore, and I think it's important for me to acknowledge that I make this podcast on the traditional lands and home of the Tongva Nation. This game presents us with a rich opportunity to get in touch with the living cultures that surround us, and I hope you can take a moment to reflect on the history of the land you stand on and the figures in the cards you play.